Today, we're absolutely thrilled to have Thane Rosenbaum and Ayelet Shaked. Touro, an international institution, has branches in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Moscow, Berlin, and Jerusalem. And we're thrilled today to continue our activities despite the COVID pandemic. Since joining Touro almost a year ago, Thane has done a number of fantastic programs, including a recent one, a year update on the US Supreme Court. Ayelet Shaked is an Israeli activist, engineer, and politician who's been in politics only for about a decade, but has had an amazing career, which is including working on the Likud Central Committee, working for the current Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu, joining religious parties despite being a secular member, and in addition, currently now being in the opposition. At the time of the COVID-19 pandemic, increasing threats from Iran, disruption politically and socially in the United States, and questions about a new peace deal and annexation, there's a tremendous amount to talk about with Ayelet Shaked. And we're absolutely thrilled that Thane, who talks like no one else does, is here to speak with her for the next 45 minutes about some burning issues that are important even at this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, because we all hope to see it and go back not to life as normal, but to dealing with the important issues that Thane and Ayelet will talk about today. Welcome to Touro, FOLCS, and today's session. Thane, please take it away.
Good morning, everyone. You're all part of a global audience. On behalf of Touro Talks and the FOLCS Conversation series, I'm Thane Rosenbaum. You're going to be treated to something very special this morning. You're going to meet very soon one of Israel's most dynamic and original public figures, a former justice minister and now presently the head of the Yamina alliance. And in my opinion, you'll remember this day when you tuned in because you were listening to a future Israeli prime minister when she was just built her new alliance on the religious right, the Yamina alliance. Ayelet, thank you. Welcome. I appreciate that you're here. You're a good friend and an incredible patriot. Ayelet, let's start with the obvious point. This Israel's second wave of the coronavirus. We're obviously concerned. 1,000 new cases a day. Over 400 deaths, 21% unemployment. Apparently, I read that there was protests yesterday in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv. Let me just start off by asking you, is everyone in the Shaked family healthy? Are you okay?
Yeah, thank you. Everyone in my family healthy. And as you said, yes, we are in the second wave in Israel. We have a very, a good percentage regarding death, only 400 in all Israel from the beginning of COVID-19, but in a very high percentage of unemployment. Israel actually entered COVID-19 with almost zero unemployment, less than 4%, and now we are standing in 20%, and this is, as I see, the main issue in Israel, how to have the working force get in business, and all the restaurants, all the things that are not working, how to get them to work and to work fast. And in my view, I think we will be with COVID-19 for a year or even two. So in my mind, we need to know how to live with it, and not, to shut down the entire state of Israel.
No one needs to tell you, because we're going to talk about your military service at some point, but Israel, more so than any other country in the world, is very used to hearing sirens. They know about sirens. They hear from either attacks from Gaza or Lebanon or even Yom HaShoah, right? They're sirens. Israel's never experienced anything like this. And this is a country that is always tested its, moral and physical fortitude But this is unlike anything, certainly in your lifetime and maybe in the nation's entire history, right?
Yeah, right. So Israel is used to crisis, but this is a different one. Nevertheless, I think that we have a good conditions because we are like an island country. You know, Israel has a close border, and we are a small country that is used to crisis, different crises, but we're used to crisis. It's not something very unique.
Right.
And I think, you know, this specific government went to sleep between the first wave to the second wave. And the problem is that they didn't build a system of epidemiologic investigators. In New York, for example, there are 20 million people with 70,000 investigators. In Israel, we start the second wave in 27 investigators, nurses that did the investigation. And this was actually, I think, the reason that the second wave went so fast. And now the challenge of the government is to establish a mechanism that will cut the infection.
Without a complete lockdown.
Yes, in my view, the lockdown is something that the government should not use. Because look, if you look at the data of the number of deaths that we have here and the number of the severe sickers, the people who are sick, it's only like 30 people who need to get anshama.
The respirators.
Yeah, so only 30 in all Israel and less than 200 severe cases. And this is why I don't think the government should run to quarantine or shutdown.
Okay, let's talk a little about the third Israeli parliamentary elections. You know, from a point of view of an American living in an American democracy, we only have two parties. It took 3 elections, 18 months, without really a resolution. And in fact, without the coronavirus, Ayelet, it's not clear we wouldn't be going through a 4th election, right? It was only in the spirit of needing to accomplish a coalition during the coronavirus. You were part of 2 different parties during the 18 months. You led the New Right coalition, and then eventually you wound up building a new alliance, the Yamina alliance, which did well, and you're now back in the Knesset. I'm wondering that whether the Israelis, was this an unusual 18 months, or would you say, look, Thane, this is Israel. This is our election system. We're happy with it. I'm curious, are Israelis frustrated, or they're saying this is unique to the last 18 months?
So it's very unique, and it is because of the situation of the Prime Minister. Because the Prime Minister is under indictment, was under investigation, and after that under indictment, there was a big block on the left, and actually no party from the left, and also Lieberman from the right, wanted to sit with him. And this is why we had to do few elections, but it is very, very unique, and only because of the situation of the Prime Minister. Actually, in Israel, we always envy in the United States that you have 2 parties, conservative, Democrats, Republican, Democrats, that's it. And so in Israel, we have many parties, but it is because of the different tribes that we have here in Israel, the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, the right, the modern Zionists, or the modern Orthodox, the left, the Arabs. But we always look at the American political system and say, oh, why in Israel we don't have only 2 parties? But usually, you know, the previous government, the government that I was the Minister of Justice back then, we had great 4 years.
Yeah.
4 years. And the reason that we had a loop of elections, it's only because of the indictment against the prime minister, because there was a huge debate in Israel whether a prime minister with indictment can do his job or that he needs to resign. So according to the law, he can. But many parties said that even though the law enables him to do the job, he shouldn't do it because of moral reasons. So this is why we had a loop of different elections. It's very unique.
Yeah, it's funny, many Americans are learning through Israel, through Netflix, watching the TV show Fauda. And I can't help but think that, Fauda means chaos. So from an American's perspective, they think even the Israeli elections is Fauda.
Yeah, but not anymore.
Not anymore. So let's talk, you mentioned about the multiplicity of Israeli tribes. I love that. There's something very interesting about you. The Yamina alliance is comprised, you are the darling of the right. The religious Jews in Israel love you. They're part of your large constituency. You head up an alliance that is primarily religious in nature, and you yourself are secular, and you're a woman. This must be for America, this would be shocking. How is it possible that a woman who is avowedly a secular leader is leading in the Israeli religious right? Tell us how you pulled that off. But it seems like an incredible achievement. And what is it about Israeli society that's even possible?
So when I entered politics and I decided to run for the primaries in the Jewish Home Party, which is a religious party, many people in the political environment and outside the political environment told me, you don't have a chance. Religious people will never elect a woman, a secular woman. Don't even try. But I personally believed in the relationship and in the connection between secular that respect the religious values. And I just had a long primaries, almost 6 months, and I got elected. For the first time, I was elected on the second place. On the second time, I was elected on the first place. And actually, I am a symbol to coexistence between secular and religious, even in the same party. And I think that as long as we respect one another, we can definitely coexist together.
Well, you clearly represent the religious right. They've obviously picked the right person because they have a charismatic leader. But, in the United States, there's always the conflict between religion and liberty, right? You hear this all the time. We'll talk about a little. I know that you're an engineer by training, but I know that you're interested in American in natural rights thinking from John Locke in the Second Treatise on Government, which is very interesting about you. We're going to talk about that soon. But I'm just curious that in your experience as a political leader, has there been any conflict with your constituents, the relationship between liberty and religious freedom, because you come at it from a secular perspective? Have you ever had to change, have you been having to change or modify your own opinions in order to reflect your constituency? Or does it really work out that there is a consensus and the consensus leads you to be able to represent them as a secular woman?
It works out because, in my opinion, although I'm secular, I'm very conservative. And in Israel, there is ongoing tension. Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. And there is ongoing tension between those values. But I personally believe that those values can coexist and they should be parallel. No value should be above the other. Israel is a Jewish state and Israel is a democratic state. And I think that actually my party and myself, we proved that we can coexist. Those values can coexist. And I said many times that I think that if Israel will be more democratic, it will be more Jewish, and it will be more Jewish, it will be more democratic state. And of course that in Israel, we have full civil rights for every minority. And myself, as a Minister of Justice, I promote many Arabs.
Yeah, I want to talk about that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I promote many Arabs to the judicial system, and I elected the first woman as a Qadi in a Sharia court.
Yes.
I was the first Minister of Justice who built a court in an Arab city. So I definitely believe in coexistence of the Arabic society with the Israeli society. But as a national rights, definitely Israel should be a Jewish state.
So let's talk a little about this vibrancy of Israeli democracy that you really demonstrated as justice minister. So you appointed 4 Supreme Court justices, but more interestingly, 6, right? 6. That's right. That's the majority at this point. Are Shaked appointees.
40% of the court.
40%. So, but you also appointed 3 Ethiopians to federal court positions, a Druze Arab, a Haredi woman, and as you pointed out, a woman to a Sharia court. When people talk about, the one democracy in the Middle East, your appointments to the judiciary alone speak to the vibrancy of Israeli democracy. But also I would like to talk about the ideas, not just that demonstration by all those appointments of so many different kinds of people, all over women, but you yourself as a woman, in the United States, we've been a country for nearly 250 years. I'm trying to remember the exact, no woman president. Israel had an Israeli prime minister as a woman, by its 3rd decade, before its 3rd decade. I introduced you, I'm on Team Shaked. I'm absolutely convinced that I'm talking to a future prime minister of Israel. What is it about Israel that has been so welcoming? It's been from the very beginning of the Israeli political movement of Zionism and the creation of a Jewish homeland. Women in politics always made sense. They always had an impact. Tell us why, how?
First of all, Israel belongs to a very exclusive countries. There is only 21 countries that belong to these exclusive clubs as a state that were established as a democratic state. And in Israel, from the beginning, women have full rights. Of course, they could vote, and it was obvious that a woman can do almost everything, because Israel also is a very, everyone in Israel going to the army, and of course in the army there are still jobs that only men can do, but in the political arena, I think there is a consensus from the beginning of that Israel was established that a woman can do anything. And, in the Israeli parliament, there are more than 25% women. In the government, today, there are more women. When I was in the government, there are 4 out of 22. I was the only woman in the cabinet, in the cabinet ביטחוני, in the security cabinet,
security cabinet.
I was the only woman then, but in Israel, I think that it's only depend if I think it's only depending in the will, and the gender is not a barrier to be a prime minister in Israel.
So let's talk a little. I'm going to get back to when you said a moment ago about, there, even in the IDF, there are limitations, but not necessarily for you. But we'll talk about that soon. Something that most people, I don't think, know this about you. But before we get to that, tell us about your particular view, or even more importantly, on some levels, the Israeli political opinion, public opinion on the Trump peace plan. And the reason I'm asking is because, now there's all this talk about annexation of the settlements. I know that in 2015, you served on both the committee and also introduced legislation to try to finally clarify the legal status of the settlements and the settlers. So you've always believed that this was important and necessary. So I'm wondering whether or not, given the fact that you were always coming from an orientation to define the status of the settlers and the settlements themselves, what is your view of the Trump peace plan, and what is your view of the proposed annexation?
So when I entered politics in 2013, with Bennett, we published a plan that dealing with applying the Israeli sovereignty on all Area C in Judea and Samaria. Area C is 60% of Judea and Samaria. Area A and B today are under the Palestinian Authority control, and they are 40%. So we publish a plan that talking about some people say annexation, we are saying apply Israeli sovereignty on 60% of the area, on all Area C. Back then in 2013, it was when Obama was the president. No one talks about applying sovereignty, only about the two-state solution in the vast majority of Judea and Samaria. And we were very unique back then. We see that in 7-8 years, the President Trump, also talking about applying sovereignty. In Trump plan, it's applying sovereignty on 30% of the territory, not 60. But definitely, we think it's a good way to start. However, we are against establishing a Palestinian state in the heart of Israel. We think a Palestinian state is something that's dangerous for the security of Israel in the heart of Israel. And this is why if you ask me about the Trump plan as a whole, then I think applying sovereignty is a good step, but establishing a Palestinian state is a bad step. So what we hope, and this is what we're hoping to get, is to do the first step of applying Israeli sovereignty. And because of the Palestinians always reject any plan that we give them, that the United States is giving them, and they already said that they will reject the Trump plan. So we hope that we will be able to do the first step and just to apply the sovereignty. If you're asking me right now I know that President Trump is dealing with COVID-19, also the Prime Minister, and we are seeing that the windows is getting closed, actually. We're definitely afraid that the Prime Minister will not use the opportunity that we have to applying sovereignty. But when we say that we want him to apply sovereignty, we are pushing him to do it without recognize the Palestinian state and without freezing the different communities in Judea and Samaria, or the settlements as you call them. So we push the Prime Minister to apply the sovereignty, to get use of, this opportunity and use this opportunity that the administration is pushing to apply sovereignty, but not to recognize a Palestinian state. I can tell you that in my mind, I think that, the solution should be applying Israeli law on all Area C, it's 60% of the area, and that Area A and B will be in the first step as autonomy, and after that, maybe federation with Jordan, with Gaza. In Jordan, there are 70% Palestinians.
Yeah.
And in Gaza, of course, Palestinians. So they should have some kind of federation, and we should apply the Israeli law in Area C. In Area C, there are almost 500,000 Israelis, and between 100 to 200,000, depend who you ask, Palestinians. In my mind, they should get, of course, citizenship. We can have, this kind of quantity of Arabs that will join the state of Israel with full rights. And I hope that one day we will get there.
So that's an interesting point you just raised, because what you're saying is you would be happy in Area C to incorporate the Arabs who live there now and treat them like the Arabs that live in Greater Israel now, which is 20% of the population, and they should be given the same rights that they would then live in a Jewish state that's a democracy, and they would have the same rights as an Arab that lives in Haifa, right? They would become part of Greater Israel, which would include now Area C. So look, when I listen to you, and I agree with frankly so much of what you've just said, we know that there's always a conflict about the conflict. given the fact what you just said, and during the last 3 years of the Trump administration, which included the moving of the embassy, which included this extending sovereignty over the Golan, do you actually think that the two-state solution, as it was referred to for several decades now, is dead? Or are you what you said before, you're concerned that the window is closing and that it could in fact be revived? What does your gut tell you about the two-state solution?
It depends, of course, who will be the president in the United States. We don't know what will be the results of the election. I assume that if Joe Biden will win the election, then he will try to push again to the two-state solution based on the Clinton plan. And if President Trump will get the election, he will try to push to the two-state solution in his plan. Trump's plan talks about a two-state solution. He said that the Palestinian state will be smaller, without army, different borders, but it is a state. And what we're trying to achieve is to have sovereignty on 60% of the area, and in the future to have some kind of federation. So if you ask me if it is dead, no, it is not dead. And I think that if we will apply sovereignty right now on 30% of the area, it will be difficult afterwards to go back to the two-state solution according to the Clinton plan, for example.
Yeah.
So this is why we are pushing the Prime Minister to do it.
Again, more facts on the ground, more of new reality. Just briefly, Donald Trump, popular in Israel overall?
Yeah, he is. Actually, President Trump, we all know that he's a good friend of Israel, what he did with the embassy, with the Golan Heights, and also with the security.
Iran deal. Yeah, Iran deal.
Iran deal, of course, and the security cooperation between Israel and the United States, thing that no one talks about, but the security cooperation is in different levels in the current in the last 4 years. And of course, he considered to be a good friend of the State of Israel.
Let's talk a little about, in the United States, and of course you know this, especially in Reform synagogues, there is a conflict, what they call between the liberal Jews and conservative Jews in the United States. And the liberal Jews in the United States, I don't know if you know most recently, Peter Beinert's article from last week, in which he's calling for, by the way, Peter and I have debated each other many times, so obviously I have very strong feelings. He and I, we wouldn't even agree on where to have lunch. I'm just saying that this argument of, well, you know what, I don't believe in Zionism anymore. The end of Zionism, let's just have one state solution, a binational state. I mean, I don't want you to even talk about it because it's so ludicrous, and it would be like suicide for the Israelis. One state, Arab majority, Arabs that have never withdrawn their claim of river to the sea. It would be absurd. It lives in the mind of a naive liberal Jew. Okay. But when you hear things like this, because believe me, I hear things like this all the time. I'm always debating people like this. There are political leaders in Israel that have taken this position. You know what? We appreciate that you're Jewish. We appreciate that you're an American Jew, but don't tell us how to live our lives in Israel. Your children don't serve in the IDF. You don't know what you're talking about. Are you one of the Israeli political leaders that feels that way, that, look, we want you to love Israel, we want you to feel for Israel, but you're really in no position to tell us what to do when it comes to our national security? Do you feel that way? I mean, and the reason I'm asking that, in a minute I want to talk about your service to the country, in the IDF. You're very proud of that service. You have children. I assume they will be serving in that capacity. Two, when you hear criticism from American liberal Jews, is that what you're thinking? But you have no idea what you're saying, and you have no moral authority to tell me how I should live my life in the Jewish homeland.
I can tell you that Peter Barnett is living in a movie, as we said. I really don't care what he thinks. He definitely doesn't understand the problems that we have here. He doesn't understand, unfortunately, the challenges that we have here. And he can, live in New York and just talking about the end of the Jewish state. I don't know from where he was born, where his parents born, and
Massachusetts, Boston. They're in Maryland.
Okay. I don't know what his view about the Holocaust, but definitely in his mind, we don't need a Jewish state. And in my mind, we definitely need a Jewish state, and Israel is the home, by the way, of every Jew who wants to live here. And also, I'm keep telling always to my friends in United States, you have two homes. You have United States as your home, and you have Israel as your home. I don't care if you're liberal, if you're conservative. Israel is your home, always your second home. And Peter's solution just ends the Zionist the Zionist project. And I can tell you that also the very radical left politician in Israel, they don't think like him. No, even not the extreme, the most extreme left.
Meretz, for instance, Tamar Zand, right?
No. Tamar talks, Meretz, they're talking about the two-state solution. In Israel, if you're talking about a one-state solution, it's the end of the Zionist project. And no one in the Knesset talks like that. Only mainly few Arabs leader, but no leader in the Zionist parties.
That's actually so interesting. I'm glad that you clarified that. So you're saying on the farthest left in the Knesset, as far as left you go, no matter what they think about Israel's responsibility to the Palestinians, Israel's political mistakes in not producing a Palestinian homeland, what they don't believe in is the end of the Zionist project, for sure.
Right.
Let's talk about how we defend Israel, or more particularly how you defended Israel. Most people do not know that not only do you have a distinguished record of service for the IDF, but you served in the Golani Brigade, which is the most elite of the commando units. You, I think, retired as a sergeant. By the way, Ayelet, I never tell you, I feel very safe right now because you're in Israel and I'm here. But when we're usually together, I'm nervous that you'll hit me.
No, but I was only responsible on education.
Well, your husband is a fighter pilot for the IDF. Again, it goes back to the spirit of this service of this country. Many people say that the startup nation that people now think of Israel, its entrepreneurial instincts, its agility, some of it is related to the fact that there's mandatory service in the IDF. Do you have an opinion about that?
I think it's one of our roots to have a mandatory service. The IDF is army of. We wanted to have army of the people. It's true that the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, are not part of it. Most of them are not part of it, not all of them. Some of them now are joining the army. But definitely from the places that I came from, serving in the RDF is a privilege. I don't see it as an obligation, but as a privilege. And of course, I have a son, 15 years old. He wants to serve in the army. He wants to have something like something with a meaning. And in the Israeli society, to do the 2-3 years in the army, it's something that that you want to do. When you ask me what is the happiest period in your life, my answer is the army. So I'm telling many times that the army gave me even more than I gave to the army. And I think it's definitely a privilege to serve in a Jewish army, in a Jewish sovereign state. If you look at the history of the Jewish people, it's a huge privilege for me to live in a generation that we have independent Jewish state. We can protect on ourselves. We don't need anyone. And to be part of it, I think, if you're looking from an historical perspective of 2,000 years, definitely we have a huge privilege to live in this period.
I have I think an anecdote that you'll appreciate. One of the times that I was in Israel, I happened to be near the Kotel during that period of time when the soldiers get sworn in to the IDF, sometimes in Masada, I'm told, sometimes at the Kotel. And at the time, I was very, there was only everyone was wearing a uniform, and I stopped a young officer who was of African descent. I immediately assumed he was Ethiopian. I talked to him, I realized his English was superb. He said to me, both my parents are from Chicago, Illinois. They were African Americans. They moved to Israel to raise their children. They were not Jews, but they wanted to be part of Zionism. They thought this is where to raise the children. She had a younger brother. This kid, I think, was a major in the IDF. I'll never forget this, Ayelet. You can tell your husband. It's an amazing story. So I said, well, whatever happened? He said, well, my parents eventually, after we raised, they moved back to Illinois. And I said, what happened to you and your brother? I said, no, we're still here, and I'm a full-time officer in the IDF. So I said, defending this country is very important to you. And he had sunglasses, and he rolled it down, and he said, very important. And I have to tell you, it was one of the more powerful things. I don't know if he ever converted to Judaism, but this was a young boy raised in Israel as an African American here and defending the Jewish homeland. Speaking of the Jewish homeland, you've had some interesting role to play in the basic law of the addition of a basic law, the nation state of the Jewish people. There was some controversy about this, right? That remember, Israel doesn't actually have an official constitution. Maybe one day it will. It has basic laws. You could look upon them as if they're the Bill of Rights that don't really fall in yet into the Constitution until they become incorporated. A year or two ago, as you know, you were part of the people who drafted legislation to make a new basic law that actually defined Israel as for the first time, said the obvious, that it's the homeland of the nation state of the Jewish people. There was some controversy, even among some Israelis. The Druze Arabs felt somewhat shunted. But one of the interesting things that I read about this is that you took the position that there is nothing incompatible about Judaism and democracy. In fact, democracy learned how to develop itself through Judaism. Can you talk a little about that? You made that argument that we keep hearing about the separation between Jewish character of Israel and its democratic character, but you don't see any inconsistency in that.
Right, as I said, I think those values can coexist as long, of course, as we are giving full civil rights to all the minorities, which we are. And in Israel, as you said, we don't have a constitution, unfortunately. We have only basic law. And we have a basic law of human rights and basic law that I'm talking about the Knesset, the government. We have the basic law that talks about Israel as a democratic state. But we didn't have a basic law that talks about the Jewish character of the country. And the Supreme Court, in some cases, took in his verdict, took the liberal values above the Jewishness of the country. And we just wanted to give to the Supreme Court a tool, a constitutional tool to balance between the fact that Israel is a Jewish state and a democratic state. We have, few cases that we thought it's needed. We had a big wave of immigration from Africa in between 2012 and 2015. And so the Knesset legislate few laws about those immigration. They were walking immigration from Eritrea and Sudan. And we thought that the fact that Israel is a Jewish state, we should keep the character of Israel as a Jewish state, and we should not open our gates to all the people in Africa that want to have a better life. So there was ongoing debate with the Supreme Court about this specific point. So we thought it's needed to have the Jewishness of the country be part of a basic law. And the meaning was only to give a tool to the Supreme Court for its interpretation when they interpret regular laws.
Before we say goodbye to you, because I know you've got other things to do, I'm going to take two quick more questions, and we'll have a little closing announcement, and then we'll say good morning, or actually for you, it's the end of the day. You were also involved in the passage of the 2016 counterterrorism laws, and always have taken a strong view of counterterrorism. One of the things that's interesting, people don't realize, Israel does not have a death penalty, and only implemented it one time for Adolf Eichmann after the trial. It's an interesting little anecdote about Israel. But you're among some Israelis that take counterterrorism and terrorism very seriously, that in your view, the worst of the worst in terrorism would deserve the death penalty.
Right, so unlike United States, in some countries in the United States, in Israel, we don't have a death penalty, only for the Nazis, and we use it for Eichmann. But we have death penalty in the army courts, but we never use it. And I said that when there is a severe terror attack, like a few years ago, we had a terror attack of 2 terrorists that killed an entire family. They just slaughtered all the family, the Fogel family, in the home, the children, the mother, the father, the baby. And I said, okay, in this kind of cases, we should use a death penalty. It's ongoing debate in Israel. The persecution is not asking for a death penalty in Israel. This is why we never use it. But I think that in very severe cases, we should.
All right, one last question, and I'll have a closing announcement. We'll say goodbye to Ayelet. Bibi, Prime Minister Netanyahu, you've served under him, you've served with him, you served him in Likud, you served him in his cabinet, you're now in the Knesset. He's an extraordinary political figure when you think about how much he looms large over Jewish history. I'm not asking you to talk about your personal views or your professional views, but I do think he is an interesting character in a way, because he's been with us for many years. And it does seem as if everything about Israel right now is either yes, Bibi, or no, Bibi. It seems everything is defined by that. He's now the longest serving prime minister. On some basic measurements, he's been phenomenally successful when you look at some basic core principles. But I mean, what is it like in Israel when you have, it's a democratic country, but you have one political figure that has loomed so large over everything? I mean, I think most Americans don't realize that, that he's on everyone's mind all day,
Because you have a better structure. You have limited of 8 years. President could be only 8 years. I think also in Israel we should do it. Maybe 12 years. The fact that a leader is in power for so many times, for so many years, I don't think it's healthy. But he's getting elected over and over again. Now there is, I think, a political crisis because he doesn't deal right with the COVID-19 crisis. But, we're a democratic state. The people choose its leaders, and he's still with us.
Before I give the last announcement, one last thing is that, you and I share some number of things in common. One is we feel very strongly about Kurdish independence.
Right.
I've for years been a human rights law professor arguing on behalf of Kurdish independence. To me, there's the story of the Kurds is really extraordinary story of heroism. They fought ISIS for the United States, right? I mean, when you think about who they are, you like to point out that in the army, the Kurdish army, women serve in there. Where else in the Muslim world would you find that? Also important last part about this, that you are also of partial Iraqi descent. And I wonder whether that has also a sense of your affection for the Kurds.
So no, it's not related. My father is Iraqi, who born in Iran, actually in Tehran, and he came to Israel from Tehran. But it doesn't relate to the fact that I think that the Kurdish people, they deserve to have a state. They fight ISIS. They won ISIS for all the Western world. And I think that the fact that the United States and Europe always throw them away and they don't give them the rights that they belong, it's pretty sad. Also, they have internal issues inside of them. They are not really, they can't really get united
Yeah.
inside. But I definitely think that they deserve a state. And I think that they did a very, very good with ISIS and for the whole West.
Yes, we owe them a debt of gratitude. All right, before we say goodbye to Ayelet, we have upcoming events. Tomorrow night, we have an event, Conversations in Essential Cinema. The film is The Graduate, and the guest is William Fichtner, the American award-winning actor. On Wednesday night, we have a special Touro Talks discussion about pandemics in Jewish history. That's Wednesday night. And then I think on July 24th, we're going to have a real conversation. There we go. There's a new Netflix documentary on the Jeffrey Epstein affair. We have two of the lawyers that represent the victims in the Jeffrey Epstein matter, a reporter for the Washington Post, and the director of that movie for Netflix. Ayelet, you are a national treasure, and we really very, very much appreciate having you in our life, in our political system. You have been a very good friend to me, and we always wish you good health and Godspeed. And great strength on behalf of the Jewish people. Ayelet, you are a treasure. Thank you so much.
Thank
Good
you
day,
very
everyone.
much.
Thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.